The night my husband left me, he didn't call. He didn't come home. He sent a text. 11:43 at night. I was 8 months pregnant, with triplets. And the last line of his message said, "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be." I sat on the edge of the bathtub in the dark, my hands on my belly, 3 babies moving inside me, and I thought, who does this to a person? But then a quieter thought arrived, the one I had been running from for 2 years. Did I know this was coming? The answer was yes. I had known. I had just chosen not to believe what I already knew. What happened next? The lies I uncovered, the woman I became, the morning I stood in a hospital room alone and heard 3 voices for the first time, changed everything I thought I understood about strength, about starting over, about what it means to finally stop pretending you are less than you are. This is my story, and if you have ever made yourself smaller to survive inside someone else's life, I think you need to hear it. 1-sentence lesson. The hardest prison to escape is the one you built yourself, because the door was never locked. If something in those 30 seconds already felt familiar, stay. Because the best part of this story is not the betrayal, it's what grew from it. Like this video, leave a comment with 1 word that describes how you feel right now. And if you know someone who is carrying something heavy today, share this with them. They might need it more than you know.
The phone buzzed at 11:43 at night. Vivian heard it. She was lying on her left side because Dr. Weston said that was better for circulation. 1 pillow between her knees, 1 pillow pressed against her lower back. The bedroom was dark and quiet, and the only sound was the hum of the heating system and the occasional creak of the old townhouse settling into the November cold. She heard the buzz. She did not move. Moving required negotiation at 8 months pregnant with triplets. Every shift of position was a conversation with gravity. So she lay there for a moment, eyes open, staring at the pale gray wall she had chosen herself 2 years ago from a stack of paint swatches. The color called Whisper Morning, which had seemed meaningful at the time, and now just looked like a wall. The phone buzzed again. She reached for it slowly, squinted at the brightness of the screen. It was from Conrad. Her husband was in Singapore this week, or Hong Kong. She had stopped tracking the cities 6 months ago when the cities began to blur together, the way seasons do when you are too tired to notice them changing. He traveled 40 weeks a year. She had told herself that was the shape of his work. She had told herself many things. She opened the message. She read it once, then she sat up, which took effort, and a small sound she did not mean to make, and she read it again. I have been doing a lot of thinking. I am not coming back, Vivian. I think we both know this has not been working for a long time. My attorney will be in touch. Please do not make this harder than it needs to be. That was all. No period of grace. No phone call first. No flight home to sit across from her and say the words to her face. Just a text. At 11:43 at night. To his 8 months pregnant wife. She sat very still for a long moment. Her hands were on her belly automatically, the way they always went. She could feel the babies moving. Small, rolling movements. The one on the lower left always stirred around this hour. She had been calling that one the night owl in her head, a private name she had never shared with Conrad because Conrad had been too distant for months, and she had learned to hold certain tenderness inside herself, away from his particular brand of blankness. She looked at the text again. My attorney will be in touch. Not, I am so sorry. Not, I will make sure you and our children are taken care of. Not, I love you, but I cannot do this. Just, my attorney will be in touch. She set the phone face down on the nightstand. She lay back down, stared at the ceiling. The heating hum continued. The house creaked once. She thought, he sent that by text. She thought, I am 8 months pregnant, and he sent it by text. She thought, who does that to a person? And then quieter and more frightening than the other thoughts. Did I know this was coming? The answer sat in her chest, like something she had swallowed a long time ago and never quite digested. Yes, she had known. Not the specifics, not the attorney or the text or the timing, but the shape of it, the particular quality of silence that had been growing between them for a year and a half. The way he looked at her, sometimes, like she was a problem he was calculating the cost of. She had known. She had chosen, very deliberately, not to know. She got up carefully, one motion at a time, and walked to the bathroom in the dark. The tile was cold through the fabric of her nightgown. The bathroom smelled like the gardenia soap she ordered from a shop in Savannah, Georgia. She had been ordering it for 3 years. Conrad had never commented on the smell. Not once. She had always thought that was normal. She thought about it differently now. She sat on the edge of the tub. The porcelain was cool through the thin cotton. The window above the sink showed a small rectangle of Boston sky, orange-gray, with reflected light, the particular color of a city that never goes fully dark. She sat there and let the information exist in the room. Her marriage was over. She was 8 months pregnant with 3 children. Her husband was in a time zone 12 hours away, and he had ended everything with a text message and the phrase, "Please do not make this harder than it needs to be." She picked up her phone. She checked the message 3 times. Lock, unlock, read. Lock, unlock, read, lock. Then she opened a browser. She typed, "Can a husband file for divorce while his wife is pregnant in Massachusetts?" She read. She clicked. She read more. At some point she typed, "Rights of pregnant women in divorce proceedings." Then, how to find a good divorce attorney. Then she stopped. She had put the phone face down on the edge of the tub. She sat in the dark bathroom with the gardenia soap and the orange-gray sky, and she let herself be exactly where she was, not planning ahead, not building the next step, just sitting with the enormous, specific weight of this night. The babies moved, all 3 of them, small and warm and oblivious. She put both hands flat on her belly. She said quietly, to no one, or perhaps to all 3 of them, "I don't know what's coming, but we're going to figure it out." She believed it in the distant way you believe in a country you have never visited. It was true. She just could not picture it yet. She did not sleep that night. She lay in bed until the light through the curtains turned from black to gray to the pale gold of early morning. Then she got up and made tea and sat at the kitchen island and looked at the back garden where the roses were brown and dead against the November fence. She should have deadheaded them in September. She had meant to. She had been 8 months pregnant and tired, and she had meant to do it later, and later had become, now the roses were gone. She thought, that is a very small thing to be thinking about. She thought, maybe that is the right size of thing to think about right now. At 8 in the morning, she called Dr. Carol Weston's office. Not because she was in labor, not because anything was physically wrong, because she needed to hear the voice of someone she trusted, and Dr. Weston was the person she trusted most in this particular season of her life. Dr. Weston's nurse put her through. "Vivian," Dr. Weston said. Her voice was direct and warm in the proportion that Vivian had come to depend on. "What's happening?" Vivian told her. She kept her voice even. She described the text, the attorney, the night. She described it the way you describe a medical symptom, specifically without drama, so the person on the other end gets the accurate information. There was a pause. "Are you safe?" Dr. Weston asked. "Are you calm?" "I'm calm." Vivian said. I don't understand why I'm so calm. Shock, Dr. Weston said. It will lift. When it does, call me. In the meantime, I want you to eat something real, drink water, and I want you in for a check on Thursday regardless. Okay, Vivian said. Vivian. Yes. You are going to be all right. A pause. I need you to hold on to that right now, even if you cannot feel it. Just hold it. She held it. Like holding a stone in a closed fist. She could not feel its warmth yet. But it was there. She made toast. She ate half of it standing at the counter. She looked at the dead roses through the glass. Then she found the small notebook she kept in the drawer by the stove, the one she used for grocery lists and thoughts she did not want to forget, and she opened to a clean page. She wrote, 1. Find an attorney, today if possible. 2. Do not call Conrad. 3. Do not call Sloan yet. Not until I have more information. 4. Call Mom? She stopped at number 4. Her mother, Ruth Calloway, was 61 years old and lived in Brattleboro, Vermont, in the same house where Vivian had grown up. She was a practical woman who had raised Vivian alone after Vivian's father walked out when Vivian was 7 years old. Ruth had never spoken badly about him. She had never cried about it in front of Vivian. She had simply gotten up every morning and done what needed doing. And somewhere, in the watching of that, Vivian had learned the shape of quiet strength without ever knowing she was learning it. She would call her mother tonight. First, the attorney. She went to her phone and opened her contacts. There was a number she had saved 2 years ago at a dinner party. A friend of a friend had mentioned a divorce attorney, and she had saved the number without examining too carefully why. Nate Ashford. She had never met him. She had saved the number and moved on and never thought about it again. Or told herself she never thought about it again. She dialed. He answered on the third ring. His voice was measured and quiet, the voice of someone who was used to people calling with difficult news. Mr. Ashford, she said, my name is Vivian Harlow. I need to retain a divorce attorney. I am 8 months pregnant with triplets, and my husband ended our marriage by text message last night. She paused. I believe there may be financial irregularities I don't yet have the full picture on. I can be in your office today. A brief silence. Then Nate Ashford said, I have a 10 o'clock cancellation. Can you make that? Yes, she said. She closed the notebook. She went upstairs and got dressed. She was steady. Her hands did not shake. She was moving through this the way she moved through most hard things. One step, then the next step, then the next. The shock had not lifted yet. She knew it would, for now she had a 10 o'clock. The call from Conrad's attorney came at 9 the following morning. His name was Harrison Price. She had met him twice. Once at a company dinner 3 years ago, where he had complimented her dress and looked through her the way certain men look through wives, as if they are furniture of good quality. Once at a charity event where he had shaken her hand and smiled, and she had thought, this man has never once been fully present in a conversation. He was very professional on the phone. He said that Conrad had retained him. He said that Conrad was hoping to handle the situation quietly and quickly. He said the word amicably 3 separate times in the first 90 seconds. Vivian listened without interrupting. Then she said, I am 8 months pregnant with triplets, Mr. Price. I think we both understand that there is nothing amicable about this situation. Please have any documents sent to Nathan Ashford's office. He is representing me. A brief pause. Of course, Harrison Price said. Conrad is fully committed to the well-being of the children. The children, not our children. Not his children, the children, unlike they were a line item. I am sure he is, Vivian said pleasantly. Have a good morning. She hung up. She sat at the kitchen island for a moment. Then she opened Conrad's phone messages. She still had access to his account. No one had thought to revoke it. Either an oversight or a sign that the plan had been executed in some haste despite its apparent preparation. She looked at his recent threads. She was not looking for anything specific. She found something specific anyway. A thread with a contact named Petra. The last message in the thread had been sent at 7:41 the previous evening, 4 hours before his text to Vivian. It said, "Done." One word. Vivian stared at it for a long time. Then she looked at the thread's start date. 9 months ago. She was sitting in the kitchen that she had designed with a decorator Conrad had hired, in the house Conrad had purchased, wearing a maternity dress Conrad had not noticed. And the thread on her husband's phone stretched back 9 months, the entire length of her pregnancy, and the last message, before he ended their marriage, was one word. Done. She set the phone down. She went to the sink. She filled a glass of water and drank all of it standing there. She thought, I need to know who this is. She thought, I need to know everything. She searched the name Petra with Conrad's name together. A LinkedIn profile appeared immediately. Petra Davenport, 34 years old, Senior Director of International Development, Harlow Enterprises. She had worked for Conrad for 3 years. She had been at the company Christmas party. Vivian had shaken her hand. She remembered the details clearly now. A navy dress with precise tailoring, posture that was almost military, eyes that were careful in a way that Vivian had registered and not thought about again. Not triumphant, not guilty, careful. She looked at the profile photo for a long moment. Then she opened Conrad's company directory. She still had access, apparently. No one had revoked that either. And found Petra Davenport's direct extension. She did not call it. Not yet. She sat with the number and let herself think clearly about what she was dealing with. Her husband had an affair. The affair had been ongoing for the entire pregnancy. He had sent his final message to his affair partner 4 hours before ending his marriage by text. That was what the surface looked like. She had been a curator for 8 years before the marriage. She knew the difference between a surface and what lived underneath it. She added Petra Davenport's number to her contacts. Then she called Nate Ashford. I found a name, she said. Petra Davenport. She works for Conrad. I need to know everything about her involvement in the financials. Already running it, Nate said. He had said the previous day that he had already started pulling public records on Conrad's company structures. There's something there, Vivian. I need 2 more days. Take them, she said. But be fast. Joa, the letter arrived 3 days later. It was delivered to the house, which meant someone had specifically directed it here rather than to any professional address. No return name. Just the Beacon Hill address in handwriting that was precise and vertical. Each letter formed with intention. Inside, 1 sheet of cream paper. I know what you must think of me. I understand completely if you never speak to me. But there are things you need to know before the lawyers make communication impossible. I am not who you think I am in this situation. Please call me. A phone number. Vivian read it twice. She put it on the kitchen counter. She walked to the back garden. She stood in the cold November air and looked at the dead roses for a long time. The fence needed painting. The hydrangeas were stripped bare. The garden looked like it had been waiting for something that had not come. She went back inside. She picked up the letter. She dialed. Petra answered on the second ring. Her voice was not what Vivian had expected. It was quiet, careful the way her eyes had been careful at the Christmas party. And underneath the quiet, something unsteady. Vivian? Petra said. Yes? Vivian said. A pause long enough that Vivian almost ended the call. Then Petra said, "I did not know you were pregnant when it started. He told me the marriage had been over for more than a year. He said you had a formal separation agreement. 14 months old." She stopped, started again. "He showed me documents. A separation agreement with your signature on it." Vivian was very still. "That is not my signature," she said. "I know," Petra said, quietly. "I know that now." The conversation lasted 47 minutes. Vivian sat at the kitchen island and listened and did not say much, because she was processing, and because her voice, if she used it too much, would give away things she was not ready to give away yet. Petra talked. The story came out in careful pieces, the way someone tells a story when they are still ashamed of their part in it, even when they understand they were deceived. Conrad had approached Petra 2 years ago. Persistent, deliberate. He had constructed a specific fiction, a marriage that was legally and emotionally over, a wife who had moved on, an arrangement that both parties understood. He had shown documentation, a separation agreement that looked official, looked real, bore a signature, almost Vivian's signature. The V hooked right instead of left. Petra sent the photograph while they talked. Vivian opened it and zoomed in on the signature and felt something cold and specific move through her. Someone had studied her handwriting carefully enough to almost replicate it. That required time, intention, planning. "When did you realize?" Vivian asked. 3 weeks ago, Petra said. "I overheard a phone call. He was talking to his mother." Her voice changed. Something harder entered it. She knew about the pregnancy. She knew the plan. She told him to do it before the birth because it would be cleaner. A pause. Her exact word. Vivian heard the word cleaner. She thought, Margaret. She thought, "Of course." "I'm sorry," Petra said. "I know that doesn't repair anything. I know that. But I needed you to know that I was not a knowing participant. I was given a false picture of reality, and I believed it because he was very convincing, and because I—" She stopped. "Because I wanted to believe it. And that is my part in this. I own it." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate you telling me," she said finally. "I need everything, every document he showed you, every conversation you can reconstruct." "I have it ready," Petra said. "I've been preparing it since I heard that phone call." Vivian ended the call. She sat at the counter. She did what she always did when the feelings were too large for the space she was in. She did the dishes. She washed 3 mugs that were already clean. The hot water over her hands. The soap. The ordinary motion of something simple and real. She thought, he lied to both of us. She thought, he used both of us. She thought, the villain is not who I thought. The villain was a man who had manufactured entire false realities and placed other people inside them without their knowledge or consent. A man who had been planning this for a year and a half while she grew his children and chose the paint color for the nursery and believed she was living in a marriage. She dried the mugs. She thought, I am not crazy. I know what I saw. I know what I know. That thought arrived like a handhold on a cliff face. She held onto it. She had known Margaret Harlow for 3 years and understood her in the way you understand weather. You do not argue with weather. You do not expect it to be different from what it is. You read it accurately, and you prepare accordingly. Margaret was 64 years old and had been the center of the Harlow family's gravity for 4 decades. She was a woman of precise opinions and immovable certainties. And she had always treated Vivian with the particular warmth of someone who is maintaining a temperature for strategic reasons rather than because the room is genuinely warm. Vivian had always known this. She had told herself it did not matter because she was not marrying Margaret. She was marrying Conrad. She thought about that now. The phone rang. While she was looking at the dead roses again, her palm against the cold glass of the kitchen door, the screen said, Margaret Harlow. She answered. Vivian, Margaret said. Her voice was warm in the precise way of a room kept at exactly the right temperature because the temperature was useful. Margaret, Vivian said, I imagine Conrad has been in touch. He sent a text. A brief pause. Yes, well, I want you to know that the family will absolutely ensure that you and the babies are provided for. There will be nothing to worry about on that front. The babies, again? Not our grandchildren, not Conrad's children, the babies. You knew, Vivian said, not a question. A longer pause this time. Vivian, marriage is complicated. Conrad has been unhappy for some time, and when a person, you told him to do it before the birth, Vivian said, because it would be cleaner. She let the word sit in the silence between them. I know what you said, Margaret. I know exactly what you said and when you said it. The temperature in Margaret Harlow's voice dropped several degrees, not to coldness, to something more precise than coldness, control. I don't know where you received that information, Margaret said, but I would caution you against I'm not asking for caution, Vivian said. I'm telling you what I know, and I'm telling you something else. She paused. The babies moved, all three of them, at once. A rolling wave of small lives inside her. I am going to fight for everything these children are owed. Not because I am angry, because they deserve it, and because I refuse to allow any member of this family to treat three people I love as an inconvenience to be managed before a convenient deadline. Silence. Then Margaret said, quietly and with great precision, You should know your position, Vivian. I know exactly my position, Vivian said. I'm the one still standing. She ended the call. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her most. She drove to the public garden. She should not have been driving this late in the pregnancy, probably. Dr. Weston would have something to say about it, but she needed to be somewhere that was not that house. And she needed to be moving, and she needed air that did not carry the smell of gardenia soap and Conrad's absence. She parked on the street and did not get out. She sat in the driver's seat and looked at the bare trees through the windshield. November in Boston. The pond reflected the gray sky. The city continued around her, indifferent and continuous, which was somehow the right quality for this moment. She turned on the radio. A Christmas song was playing. It was not yet Thanksgiving, and already the Christmas songs had started. She changed the station, found something soft and instrumental, piano over strings, no lyrics to interrupt the quiet. She sat there for 20 minutes. She did not think about Conrad. She did not plan her next move. She did not rehearse conversations or calculate the financial implications or inventory the ways she had been wrong about her own life. She just sat. The heater ran. The piano played softly. The bare trees moved slightly in the November wind. She thought, this is enough. This moment is enough. Then she put the car in drive and went home. Nate Ashford called the next morning at 8:15. His voice had the quality she was beginning to recognize, a contained precision, like a person delivering information they have checked 3 times and are certain of. Vivian, he said, I've been through the preliminary financial documentation Conrad's attorney provided. There are significant discrepancies. How significant? Conrad has been moving funds for approximately 22 months. Shell companies in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg. The structures are deliberately complex, but they are not invisible once you know where to look. A pause. The amounts are substantial. She understood what substantial meant in Nate's vocabulary. He was planning this before I became pregnant, she said. Approximately 4 months before. Yes. Another pause. Vivian, this is no longer a standard divorce proceeding. We are looking at potential financial fraud, asset concealment, and if the forgery of the separation agreement can be established as criminally actionable. He stopped, collected himself. He made a very serious mistake. He moved money and he left a paper trail. And now you have an attorney who knows where to look. She sat with that for a long moment. What do I need to do? She asked. Preserve everything, any financial documentation you have access to at the house, bank statements, any correspondence. Don't delete anything. A pause. And let me keep pulling. Pull everything, she said. She hung up. She went to the kitchen island and opened the small notebook. She wrote, he planned this before the pregnancy. She underlined it once. Then she closed the notebook and went to make tea and stood at the counter and looked at the garden and let the information settle into her body the way cold settles into a room when a window is opened. 22 months. He had been executing a plan for 22 months. Every dinner, every trip, every moment he had laid his hand against her belly and said the right things about the babies. Every single one of those moments, he had already been moving money. She thought, the hardest part is admitting I already knew something was wrong. She thought, but I did not know this. This I did not know. She thought, and knowing the difference matters. That night she reorganized the kitchen at 2 a.m. Not because it was messy, because she needed to do something with her hands. She rearranged the spice rack alphabetically. She wiped down the inside of every cabinet. She sorted the drawer next to the stove. The junk drawer full of batteries and rubber bands and takeout menus from restaurants that had since closed. She did it slowly and completely, with the focused attention she had once given to acquisition proposals at the Art Foundation. When she finished, she stood in the clean kitchen in the quiet house and looked at what she had done and felt for a moment, entirely herself, not afraid, not angry, not overwhelmed. Herself. She thought, that is still here. She is still here. She went to bed. She slept for the first time in 3 days. She told Sloan on a Thursday. They met at the coffee shop on Newberry Street they had been going to for 9 years. Since graduate school, since before Conrad, before the move to Beacon Hill, before the pregnancy, before all of it. The coffee shop had a particular smell, dark roast and warm wood and the faint sweetness of whatever the kitchen was baking. It was the smell of the friendship, in a way. It was the smell of before. Sloan was already there when Vivian arrived. She stood up when she saw Vivian come through the door, and her face did something complicated, something that tried to settle into the expression of a person waiting for routine coffee and couldn't quite get there. They hugged awkwardly around Vivian's belly. Sloan laughed, a little. Vivian sat down. She ordered herbal tea. Sloan already had her coffee. Vivian told her everything. The text, 11:43 at night. Conrad in Singapore. The attorney's call the next morning. Petra's letter. The forged separation agreement. The 9 months of messages. The 22 months of hidden assets. Margaret's phone call and what she had said about doing it before the birth, because it would be cleaner. Sloan listened. She held her coffee cup in both hands, and she listened with the quality of attention that had always been one of the things Vivian loved most about her. Sloan had always known how to listen. She did not interrupt. She did not redirect. She stayed entirely present. When Vivian finished, Sloan was quiet. Not the quiet of someone thinking what to say, the quiet of someone who has something they need to say and is deciding whether to say it. Vivian felt it. You knew something, Vivian said. Sloan looked at her coffee cup. Sloan, I didn't know any of what you just told me, Sloan said. The money, Petra, the forgery, none of that, I swear to you. But you knew something? A longer pause. The coffee shop sounds continued around them, espresso machine hissing, someone laughing at a table near the window. 2 years ago, Sloan said, Conrad came to me. He reached out directly. He said he was worried about you, that you seemed stressed and unhappy. He asked me, he framed it as wanting to fight for the marriage. He asked me to tell him if I thought you were thinking about leaving, if you mentioned problems at home. She looked up. Her eyes were red at the outer corners. He made it sound like love, like he wanted to be ready, like he wanted to protect what you had. The coffee shop noise continued. Vivian was very still. How many times did you report back to him? She asked. Sloan flinched. It was a small flinch, but Vivian had known her for 9 years, and she saw it. It was not a formal arrangement, Sloan said. How many times? A breath. 4 or 5. Over about a year. Small things. Whether you seemed happy, whether you had mentioned feeling isolated, whether you... She stopped. She reached across the table. Vivian moved her hand back. Not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly, just back. Sloane's hand stayed on the table between them. I had no idea he was building a case, Sloane said. I thought he was a man worried about his marriage. I thought I was helping you both. I know, Vivian said. Viv, I know, Vivian said again. She was quiet for a moment. She thought, I have no one left. The thought was so complete and so calm that it frightened her more than anger would have. Not one person in her world had been entirely what they appeared. Conrad, who had been planning his exit for 22 months. Margaret, who had orchestrated it. Petra, who had been deceived but had still been there. And now Sloane, who had not meant harm but had given Conrad exactly what he needed, access to Vivian's interior life, to her doubts and her loneliness and her private landscape, handed over gently and with good intentions, but handed over nonetheless. Vivian paid for both drinks. She stood up carefully. I need time, she said. I'm not done with you, but I need time. Sloane nodded. Something passed across her face that Vivian recognized as genuine grief. Not guilt, performance, real grief. Vivian walked out. She sat in the parked car in front of the coffee shop for 8 minutes. She did not start the engine. She did not cry. She did not reach for her phone. She sat with the weight of the last 2 weeks pressing down on her from all directions, and she breathed, slowly and deliberately, the way Dr. Weston had shown her, the way you breathe when your body needs more oxygen than your panic wants to give it. 8 minutes. Then she started the car. She drove home. She called her mother. Mom, she said when Ruth picked up, I need to tell you something. She told her everything the same way she had told Sloane, but faster, because her mother absorbed information quickly and did not need to be eased in. When she finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then Ruth said, Conrad Harlow was always too polished, like something lacquered over so many times you cannot see the wood underneath. You never said that, Vivian said. You were happy, Ruth said. Or you seemed happy. I was not going to hand you a problem you had not asked for. Vivienne thought about that. Are you coming? She asked. I am already packing, Ruth said. She heard the sound of drawers opening in the background. She pressed the phone against her cheek. She thought, she is coming. She is packing right now. Something in her chest, which had been locked since 11:43, 3 weeks ago, unlocked slightly. Not all the way. Just slightly. Enough. Douglas Harlow called on a Wednesday afternoon. Vivian almost did not answer. She had been sorting through the nursery, folding and refolding the tiny onesies that did not need refolding, running her hand over the 3 matching cribs she had assembled with Bee's help 3 weeks ago. The nursery was the one room in the house that felt completely true. No performance in it, no strategy. Just 3 cribs and a mobile with small carved wooden birds and a glider in the corner and the smell of new paint. The mobile had been Conrad's choice, or he had said it was his choice. She would never know now how many things he had chosen versus performed choosing. The phone rang. She looked at it. Douglas Harlow. She thought he either knew and is calling to manage me, or he did not know and is calling because his conscience will not let him stay silent. She thought, there's only one way to find out, she answered. Vivian, Douglas said. His voice was different from the last time they had spoken, at a family dinner, 6 weeks before the text. Something had gone out of it. The particular quality of a man who has always known how to occupy a room with ease and has recently lost the ability. Douglas, she said, I owe you a conversation, he said, and I owe you an apology. I would like to come and speak with you in person, if you will allow it. Come tomorrow, she said. 2 o'clock. He came. He arrived exactly on time, which was a Harlow characteristic, that particular punctuality that is less about courtesy and more about control. He was a large man, slightly stooped now, wearing a dark overcoat. He came into the kitchen and sat at the table and looked at his hands. He did not look around the room. He did not perform comfort. He sat and looked at his hands like a man preparing to confess something. Vivian made coffee. She did not offer him. She sat across the table and waited. Conrad told me 18 months ago that he was planning to end the marriage, Douglas said. He asked me not to interfere. He said you and he had discussed it, that it was mutual. We had not discussed it, Vivian said. I know that now. He did not rush past it. He held it. I should have called you then. I told myself it was not my place, that marriage is between 2 people, and I had no right to intervene. He paused. But the truth, Vivian, is that I was afraid of what I would find if I asked harder questions. I was afraid I already knew the answer. She studied him. What did you suspect? That Conrad had already moved money, that there was another person, that the story he was telling me was, he searched for the word, managed. He folded his hands on the table. Margaret has been the center of this family for 40 years. When Margaret decides something, the path of least resistance has always been to stop seeing what you are seeing. I chose that path. He looked up. I chose it for 18 months, and I am ashamed of it. It was the most honest thing any Harlow had ever said to her. She thought, he is not a villain. He is a man who chose wrong for too long and knows it. What are you willing to do now? She asked. Whatever you need, he said. Within what, I have the power to give. And I know that is not enough, but I mean it. There will be a regulatory inquiry, she said, into the asset concealment. It is possible that inquiry will need documentation from within the company's senior structure. He held her gaze steadily. I will provide whatever is needed, he said. She nodded once. Then we understand each other, she said. He left shortly after. She stood at the door and watched the car pull away. She thought, somewhere along the way, I became invisible to this entire family. She thought, but I can see myself clearly now. She thought, and so can he. Ruth arrived that evening with 2 suitcases and the absolute certainty of someone who has come for the duration and has no intention of being argued out of it. She came in through the front door and set her suitcases in the hall and looked at Vivian for a moment, a long, direct look of the kind that mothers give when they are taking inventory. Then she said, You look tired. Have you been sleeping? Some, Vivian said. We will fix that. Ruth took off her coat. Where do you keep the soup pots? She found them herself before Vivian could answer. That night Ruth made the soup she had always made when Vivian was sick or frightened or sad, chicken and rice with too much lemon, and exactly the right amount of dill. She had been making it since Vivian was small. The smell of it filled the kitchen, and Vivian sat at the island and let herself be taken care of, which was harder than she had expected, and also more necessary. "I should have fought harder when your father left," Ruth said, stirring the pot. Vivian looked up. Ruth almost never said his name or referred to him directly. "For what?" Vivian asked. "For what we were owed. I was too ashamed to fight for it, like his leaving was something I had done wrong, something visible on me that everyone could see." She kept stirring. "I told myself we did not need it, but you needed it, and I was too proud to ask." "You made us safe," Vivian said. "I made us functional," Ruth said. Safe and functional are not the same thing. Vivian thought of that for a long time after. She had been seeing Dr. Patricia Hughes for 6 years, off and on, mostly on during the years before Conrad, mostly off during the marriage because Conrad had made small, consistent comments about the cost and the time and whether she really needed it. And she had gradually agreed with him, the way you gradually agree with rain, that you should stay indoors, until staying indoors had simply become the default. She made an emergency appointment. Dr. Hughes's office was on the 3rd floor of a brownstone on Commonwealth Avenue, a room with 2 good chairs and a window that looked onto a courtyard. It was a room that asked nothing of you except to be honest, which was either a relief or a challenge, depending on the day. Vivian told her everything. She had told this story 5 times now, to Dr. Weston, to Nate, to her mother, to Sloane, to Douglas. Each time she told it, it changed slightly. Not the facts, the weight of the facts. What had seemed enormous in the first telling was becoming more precise, more knowable. The way a wound you have been afraid to look at becomes less frightening when you finally look. Dr. Hughes listened. When Vivian finished, Dr. Hughes asked, "How are you in your body right now?" "Tired," Vivian said. "And something else. I keep waiting for the full impact of the shock to arrive, and it doesn't. Like I already knew." "You used that phrase when we last met," Dr. Hughes said. 3 years ago, early in your marriage. You said you had a feeling that something was being managed, but you could not put your finger on what." Vivian looked at her hands. "I remember," she said. "What do you think you knew then?" What Vivian had known 3 years ago, Conrad had chosen her deliberately. That was the word she had always used for it in her own mind, deliberately. He had entered her life with the focused attention of a man who had decided what he wanted and intended to acquire it. He was 45 minutes late to their first date, and when he arrived, he sat down and looked at her as if she was the only thing in the room, and she had been, she could admit it now, entirely undone by that. She had been 31. She had a studio apartment and good friends and a job she was good at and a life that was the right size. She was not lonely, but she was also, somewhere in the deep interior where honesty lives, afraid that she was going to spend her life as a person who made good choices in a small life and never found out what a large life felt like. Conrad had looked like a large life. She had not had time to ask the right questions because the pace of it did not leave room for the quiet necessary to hear her own doubt. The dinners and the trips and the particular brand of attention that feels like being discovered. She had felt doubt. She could admit that now. She remembered a specific moment in a parking lot in Brattleboro, 3 months before the engagement, telling her mother, "He's wonderful, but sometimes I feel like I'm performing for him, like I have to be a certain version of myself." Ruth had asked, "Is he unkind?" She had said, "No, nothing like that," and the conversation had moved on. But the feeling had been real. She had known it was real, and she had decided very deliberately to call it nerves rather than information. She had done what Douglas had done. She had chosen the path of least resistance over the hard truth. The realization arrived, not as accusation, but as clarity. It did not feel good. It was not meant to feel good. I wanted to be chosen, she told Dr. Hughes. Not by him specifically, just by someone. My father left when I was 7. I have spent my entire adult life. She stopped, looked at the courtyard window. A pigeon was sitting on the sill, absolutely still, looking at something she could not see. You know this story. Tell it again, Dr. Hughes said. Tell it as a woman who knows what it cost. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. I married a man who had the vocabulary of permanence without any of the actual substance, she said. He knew exactly what staying sounds like. He had studied it, and I did not look past the vocabulary because looking would have required me to believe I deserved to ask harder questions. And I did not quite believe that yet. She paused. I disappeared inside this marriage, she said, not because he forced me to, because I allowed it. I stopped painting. I stepped back from the board work I loved. I made myself smaller because smaller felt safer, because he was so entirely certain of himself, and I had not found that certainty in myself yet. She looked at Dr. Hughes. I contributed to my own disappearance. I need to say that clearly, not to blame myself, not to excuse what he did, but because it is true, and because I cannot move forward if I do not own my part of it. And what is moving forward? Dr. Hughes asked. Vivienne put her hands on her belly. The babies were still, sleeping, probably. 3 small sleeping people who did not yet know anything about any of this. Being entirely myself, she said, not the version I edited for Conrad, not the version I thought a Harlow wife should be. Just me, she paused. I think I've been more myself in the last 6 weeks of catastrophe than I was in 3 years of that marriage. Dr. Hughes smiled, slightly. Warm. I know, she said. That night, Vivienne found her old sketchbook. It was at the back of the bedroom closet, behind winter coats she never wore and 2 boxes of books she had never unpacked. She had last used it 4 years ago. She recognized it by the worn corner of the cardboard cover. She sat on the floor of the closet, carefully using the doorframe as support, and she opened it. Small pencil drawings. Her studio apartment on Beacon Street. The window with the broken latch she had never gotten fixed. The public garden in early March when the ice on the pond was just beginning to break. Her mother's kitchen table, the particular angle of afternoon light on the old wood. She had been a person who drew things. She had forgotten that entirely. She sat on the closet floor for a long time, turning pages. She thought, she is still in here. She has been here the whole time. She thought, I just need to let her back out. Nate called 3 days later. We found the forgery source, he said. A notary connected to Conrad's building. I can trace the document directly to his personal assistant. This is no longer circumstantial, Vivienne. We have a chain of custody. She was quiet for a moment. What does that mean for us? It means that in any proceeding, civil or criminal, Conrad is significantly exposed. Harrison Price knows this now. I sent the documentation this morning. A pause that contained something measured and precise. We are in a very different negotiating position than we were 2 weeks ago. Good, she said. Vivienne, I want you to understand something. The financial settlement he was planning to offer was low. Given the actual asset base, it was approximately 30% of what you are legally entitled to. She thought about that. She thought about the text at 11:43 at night. She thought, please do not make this harder than it needs to be. He assumed I would not know what I was owed, she said. He assumed you would be too overwhelmed by the pregnancy and the shock to push back effectively, Nate said. He has been wrong about several things. That is the most significant. She almost smiled. "Set the mediation," she said, "as soon as possible. You should be resting." "I will rest after," she said. Set it. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday. The conference room was on the 14th floor of a building downtown. Vivian arrived with Nate at 9 in the morning. Ruth had insisted on driving her. Ruth sat in the lobby downstairs with a thermos of tea and a book she was definitely not reading. Conrad was there. She had not been certain he would be. Part of her had expected another intermediary, another managed distance. But he was there in person, and she walked into the conference room, and he was sitting across the long table in a fitted dark suit and his familiar haircut, and the posture that had once read to her as confidence and now read as something practiced over many years until it looked natural. He looked at her when she came in. Something moved across his face, a recalibration, like a person adjusting their expectations of a situation they thought they had accurately modeled. She had changed. He was noticing. She sat down. She looked at Nate. Nate opened his folder. For the first 40 minutes, the conversation was professional and procedural. Harrison Price outlined a proposed settlement. The numbers were, as Nate had prepared her, low, not insultingly low, strategically low, the kind of number proposed by someone who believes the other side does not know their full worth. At some point, Conrad said, across the table, "Vivian, I hope you know that I never wanted." "Conrad," she said. Her voice was quiet, not cold, not angry, just clear. "Please don't," she said. He stopped. Harrison Price cleared his throat. Nate said calmly and without any change of register, "Given the documentation we provided this morning, the asset structures, the forgery chain, the 22-month transfer history, the figure Mr. Price has outlined is not a serious starting point for this conversation. I want to be direct about that. We can negotiate in good faith from an accurate baseline, or we can take the criminal forgery documentation to the appropriate authorities and allow a judge to set the baseline. That is entirely Conrad's choice." The room went very still. Conrad looked at Harrison Price. Harrison Price looked at the table. The mediation changed character entirely. During the break, Vivian went to the restroom and stood at the sink. She had been avoiding mirrors for weeks. Not consciously, just finding other things to look at. The garden, the nursery ceiling, the inside of her own thoughts. She looked at herself now. The same face, but different. Not worse, not harder. Just more present, more there. The eyes of someone who had stopped pretending not to see what she was seeing. She thought, there she is. She thought, there is the person who is going to figure this out. She went back to the conference room. 2 hours later, Harrison Price asked for a recess. Vivian and Nate waited in a small side room with bad chairs and a view of another building's brick wall. "They're going to make a real offer," Nate said. "The forgery documentation is criminal exposure. Harrison Price is not going to let his client walk into that." Vivian nodded. Then she said, "The babies are moving." She pressed her hand against her belly. All three of them, all at once, a wave of small turbulent life. "They know something is happening," Nate said lightly. "Maybe," Vivian said. "Or maybe they're just hungry," she laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in weeks, and it surprised her entirely. Not a performance of lightness, but actual lightness, arriving without permission from somewhere real. Nate smiled. "How are you, actually?" he asked. She thought about it. "Better than I was," she said. "Not as good as I'm going to be." "That's the right direction," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." The terms were finalized 2 weeks later. The actual number she would not share, even later, even with Sloane during the slow, careful rebuilding of that friendship. The number was between her and the law. What she would say when people asked was that her children would be taken care of. That was the number that mattered. She sat in Nate's office after signing and looked at the papers. "Is it over?" she asked. "The financial component, yes. The divorce itself takes a few more months, but the significant battle is won." She looked at the stack of documents, clean white pages with clean black type that represented the legal dismantling of a version of her life. "He thought I would be grateful for whatever he offered," she said. "He thought I would be too exhausted from the pregnancy to fight. He built his entire plan on the assumption that I did not know my own worth." "He was wrong," Nate said. "He has been wrong about me for 3 years," she said. "I just did not know it until recently." She stood up. She shook Nate's hand. She walked out into the December air. She was 32 weeks and 4 days when her water broke. She was in the kitchen. It was a Tuesday, 11 in the morning. She was eating an orange, standing at the counter, the smell of it sharp and clean and good. And then there was a sensation she recognized from everything Dr. Weston had prepared her for, and she set the orange down very carefully on the counter. Ruth was upstairs. Vivian called up, "Mom, it's time." A brief silence, then rapid footsteps. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway in her reading glasses, book in hand, the expression of a woman who has been quietly preparing for this moment for 3 weeks, arriving now on her face. "Hospital bag?" Ruth said. "Bedroom closet," Vivian said. "Already packed. Car keys?" "Hook by the door." Ruth was already moving. Vivian stood in the kitchen and felt something she had not expected. Not fear, not the panicked, helpless dread she had imagined on the nights when she could not sleep. Something that felt, remarkably and entirely, like readiness. She thought, "I am ready. We are ready." She picked up her phone. She called Dr. Weston's emergency line. She did not call Conrad. She did not text him. She walked to the bedroom and picked up her coat. The hospital was loud in the particular way hospitals are at unexpected hours. Voices layered over intercom announcements, layered over the sounds of machinery. That means people are working very hard to keep other people alive. They moved quickly once Vivian arrived. Dr. Weston was already there, which was the quality about her that Vivian appreciated most. She was there when she said she would be there. "How are you?" Dr. Weston asked, walking alongside the bed as they moved down the corridor. "Ready?" Vivian said. "Good, because they are." They prepped her for the cesarean section in a small, bright room that smelled of antiseptic and something faintly floral she could not identify. Ruth sat in the chair by the wall. She had her coat across her lap. She was not reading. She was simply present, the way she had always been present, the particular quality of a woman who knows that sometimes the only thing you can do for another person is stay. Vivian looked at the ceiling. She thought about many things. She thought about the parking lot in Brattleboro and the conversation about Conrad she had not listened to. She thought about the sketchbook in the closet and the woman who used to draw things. She thought about the dead roses in the November garden and how she intended to replant them in spring. She thought about 3 small heartbeats that had been her constant companions for 32 weeks and 4 days, through the worst stretch of her adult life, steady and present through every difficult night. She was not afraid. She was 32 years old, and she had survived 22 months of planned betrayal and 3 weeks of building a new life from the ground up, and she was about to meet 3 people she already loved completely. She thought, "I am the right person for this. I have been the right person for this the whole time." Ruth reached across and took her hand. She held on. The cesarean section took 42 minutes. Ruth stayed at Vivian's head on the other side of the curtain. Through all of it, they looked at each other, They breathed together. Ruth's grip on her hand was steady throughout, not frantic, not performatively calm, just steady. The way Ruth had always been steady, the quality that Vivian had taken for granted for 31 years and would never take for granted again. The first cry came at 6:22 in the morning. Vivian heard it, and something broke open in her chest. Clean and total, like a window thrown wide into a morning that is cold and good. A girl, someone said. 5 pounds, 1 ounce. She is perfect. Vivienne felt tears on her face for the first time in weeks. The second cry came 40 seconds later. A boy. 4 pounds, 14 ounces. Strong lungs. Ruth laughed. A full, real laugh. The third cry came 1 minute after that. Another girl. 4 pounds, 9 ounces. All three, all healthy. 3 small, furious, alive voices. 3 people who had not existed in the world outside her body until this moment. She thought, here you are. Here, all 3 of you are. Dr. Weston's voice came over the curtain. They are all perfect, Vivian. All 3 of them. Ruth pressed her forehead against Vivian's. They were both crying in the uncomplicated, complete way that you only cry at the beginning of things. Conrad found out 3 hours later. He found out through a message passed from the hospital's administrative line to Nate's office, because Nate was still listed as her primary professional contact, and no other contact had been established by the Harlow family. He had not called this hospital. He had not reached out to Vivienne directly. He had been in the city. She would learn this later. For 4 days, finalizing settlement matters with Harrison Price. He had been 20 minutes away and he had not come. The message relayed through Nate's office. Conrad had asked if it was really 3. Nate's response, sent back, yes, 3, not healthy. Vivian as well. That was the end of the exchange. He did not appear at the hospital. She had not expected him to appear. She had, in the deep, quiet part of herself that had known from the beginning how this would go, understood that he would not come. But, in the moment of understanding that he was truly not coming, that the day passed and the door to her room opened only to Dr. Weston and Ruth and a nurse named Patricia, who had a kind face and showed her how to position 3 babies at once. Something settled in her. Final. Clean. A chapter closing. She was alone in the sense that he was not there. She was not alone in any other sense. She named them on the second day. She had names prepared. She had spent 6 weeks living alone in the townhouse with her mother and her list-making notebook, and she had had time to decide. She had not told anyone what the names would be. That had felt important, something that belonged entirely to her. The first girl, Eleanor Ruth. She told her mother in the early morning of the second day, when Ruth was sitting in the chair by the hospital window with a cup of coffee she had retrieved from the machine down the hall. The winter light was pale and gray through the window. Eleanor Ruth, Vivian said. Ruth looked at her. After your grandmother, Ruth said. And after you, Vivian said. Eleanor was Grandma's middle name and your middle name, and I would like to give it to this one, if that is all right with you. Ruth did not answer in words. The sound she made was not quite crying and not quite a laugh, something that contained both. The boy, James Arthur, the second girl, Clara May. 3 names that were real and chosen and hers to give. She lay in the hospital bed with all 3 of them arranged around her. The nursing staff had been extraordinary. Dr. Weston had personally ensured she had the room and the help she needed. And she looked at 3 small faces, 3 sets of eyes that were not yet focusing properly on anything, 3 small mouths opening and closing, 3 pairs of hands, the fingers spread like small starfish, learning already the extraordinary fact of having hands. She thought, I would not trade this, not any of it, not even the worst of it. She thought, it brought me here. The article appeared in the Boston Business Press 6 weeks after the delivery. She found it on a Thursday morning while James was asleep against her shoulder and Eleanor was in the bassinet and Clara was watching the ceiling mobile with her characteristic, focused, intensity. The headline was not about Vivian, it was about Harlow Enterprises, a formal inquiry into financial irregularities within the company's international development division. Conrad's name appeared in the 3rd paragraph. Margaret's name appeared in the 5th. Douglas Harlow had provided the key documentation. He had done what he said he would do. Vivian read the article once. She put the phone down. She looked at James asleep on her shoulder, his cheek warm and perfect against her collarbone. She felt no particular triumph. She felt no desire for Conrad to suffer. What she felt was quieter and more permanent, a sense of accuracy. The truth had arrived where it belonged, not because she had forced it there, because she had refused to help keep it hidden. That was all. That was enough. Sloane came back. It happened the way real repair happens, slowly, incrementally, with the awkward carefulness of two people rebuilding on ground that has shifted. Coffee in March. Careful and a little formal. A phone call in April. A walk in the public garden in May when the trees had finally come back and Clara was strapped against Vivian's chest in a carrier and James was in the stroller and Eleanor was staring at a duck with the philosophical intensity of someone encountering a duck for the first time and finding it inadequate. They talked, not the managed talk of two people maintaining a surface, the real kind, the kind that is uncomfortable in places and therefore trustworthy. Sloane said, I have thought about that moment in the coffee shop every single day, when you moved your hand back. I know, Vivian said. I chose comfort over courage, Sloane said. I told myself I was protecting your marriage. I was protecting myself from a hard conversation. She paused. I am going to spend a long time earning back what I used up. Vivian looked at Eleanor, who had moved on from the duck and was now staring at a pigeon with the same focused disapproval. Start small, Vivian said. Earn it incrementally. Sloane laughed. It was a different laugh from before, realer, less polished. The laugh of someone who had spent several months in honest discomfort and had come out the other side a little more truthful. I can do that, Sloane said. Good, Vivian said. She went back to the Art Foundation in April. 3 days a week to start. Ruth had committed to staying through the summer, which Vivian knew she could not accept beyond that, and intended to argue about in June. They had established a rhythm in the townhouse that worked. Ruth managed the mornings, Vivian managed the evenings, and between them, 3 small and increasingly opinionated people were fed and held and talked to constantly, because all 3 of them seemed to understand already that the world was a place that made more sense if you kept commenting on it. Her first day back, she stopped in the doorway of her office. The same desk, the same window looking onto the courtyard, the same small oil landscape she had hung the first week she started, years ago, a painting by a young artist no one had heard of yet. She had championed that artist. She had written the acquisition proposal herself and made the case in a board meeting where she had been the youngest person in the room and she had been certain she was right and she had been. She sat down at her desk. She opened her laptop. She started working. It felt like coming home to a room you had locked a long time ago and finding that the room had been waiting for you. The light was different, better, but the room was the same room, and you were the same person who had loved being in it, and none of that had actually gone anywhere. It had just been waiting. She started painting again. Small things at first, watercolor studies. the same way she had started in the sketchbook, the winter garden. The light through the kitchen window at 6 in the morning when everything was still and blue-gray, and the three babies were briefly and simultaneously asleep, and she had a cup of tea and nothing was required of her for 20 minutes. She painted that light 3 different ways and gave one to Ruth and kept the other 2. Then she painted something larger. It took her 3 weeks and she worked on it in the evenings, after the babies were down, in the hour before she became too tired to see straight. She worked at the kitchen island with the watercolors and sometimes the pencils, and once, mots, because she wanted to try oil pastels that she had not used since graduate school. 3 small figures in a field of pale yellow light, no faces yet. She had not decided on the faces. They were silhouettes, outlines, the shapes of 3 small people in a wide landscape with all the world in front of them and nothing behind them but light. She hung it in the nursery, above the mobile, with the wooden birds. She stood back and looked at it. The 3 of them were doing what babies do at around 4 months, discovering their hands. Each of them, separately and at their own pace, had developed the habit of holding their hands up and staring at them with a philosophical astonishment that Vivian found endlessly extraordinary, turning them slowly, examining them from different angles, as if the hands were a problem they intended to solve. She watched them do this. She thought, that is exactly right. That is exactly the correct way to approach a life. Look at what you have. Look at what you are capable of. Then get to work. Ruth left in July. She packed her 2 suitcases on a Sunday morning, and Vivian drove her to the bus station, and they stood on the sidewalk, with the summer heat and the noise of the city, and Ruth held each baby in turn, one at a time, saying things quietly to each of them that Vivian could not hear and did not try to. Then Ruth hugged Vivian. It was a long hug, the kind that says many things that do not need to be said aloud, because they are already entirely understood between 2 people who have been through something together. You are going to be fine, Ruth said. I know, Vivian said. Not eventually. Now. I know, Vivian said again. Ruth held her at arm's length and looked at her the way she had looked at her in the hospital. That long, direct inventory look. Then she said, there you are. Here I am, Vivian said. Ruth nodded once, satisfied, as if something had been confirmed that she had always believed and had simply been waiting to see confirmed. She picked up her bag and walked through the doors. The wisdom that Vivian would eventually arrive at, not in a single moment, but slowly, over the months that followed. The way understanding accumulates, rather than arrives, had to do with the difference between a locked door and a door you have convinced yourself is locked. She had stood at a locked door for 3 years. She had organized her life around the fact of that lock. She had made herself smaller to fit the space the lock allowed. She had told herself that this was the shape of things, that the constraint was real. The door had never been locked. She had only believed it was. And the belief had been the only prison. The permission to leave had always been hers. The permission to ask for what she deserved had always been hers. The permission to take up the full space of her own life, to paint the things she wanted to paint and do the work she was built to do, and raise 3 extraordinary small people in a household where honesty was the dominant weather. All of it had always been hers. She had been waiting for someone to grant it. No one was going to grant it. No one else had the authority to. It was hers. It had always been hers. She just had to believe that. On a Tuesday morning, in September, a year and 2 weeks after the text, she was in the nursery when all 3 of them woke up at the same time. This was rare. Vivian had come to understand that the great gift of triplets was that they rarely synchronized. which meant you could address one crisis before the next arrived. The great challenge was the occasional morning when they all decided simultaneously that the world required comment. This was one of those mornings. Eleanor was in full voice. James was working up to full voice. Clara was watching both of them with the expression she always had when she was gathering data before committing to a position. Vivian picked up Eleanor first because Eleanor was loudest. She walked to the window. The garden below was fully green now. She had replanted the roses in the spring, a morning's work with Ruth's help, and 3 babies in a row, and bouncy seats on the patio, watching with solemn attention. The roses were doing what roses do when they are properly cared for, blooming extravagantly and without apology. She stood at the window with Eleanor against her shoulder and looked at the garden. James had escalated behind her. Clara had, apparently, decided to join him. She thought, I need to go pick up 2 more children. She thought, this is my life. She thought, I built this. Not alone, not without help. Ruth and Nate and Dr. Weston, and even Douglas, had all contributed to the building of it. But she had done the work. She had made the calls. She had sat at the mediation table and stood in her own kitchen and said what needed to be said. She had fought for what her children were owed. She had found what she was owed. She had found her way back to the room she had locked. She had found, in the most improbable circumstances, running through the worst stretch of her life like a thread of light, the person she had been before the marriage. Not the same person, a larger version. A person who had been tested and had not been found wanting. A person who knew now, without requiring external confirmation, that she was exactly who she needed to be. Eleanor had stopped crying. She was looking at the window. At the light coming through, it was a September morning in Boston, and the light was the particular gold of early autumn. The light that does not last. The light that comes before the cold, and the bare trees and the long gray months of winter. Eleanor looked at it. Her small face was entirely still and entirely present. Vivian watched her looking at the light. She thought, I know exactly how you feel. She thought, it is worth looking at. She thought, look at everything. Behind her, Clara had reached her conclusion and was adding her voice to James's. The nursery was loud in the very particular and extraordinary way of a room with 3 babies in it, who have all decided simultaneously that the world requires comment. Vivian took a breath. She turned away from the window. She went to her children. She had a great deal of work to do, and she was, in every way that mattered, exactly the right person to do it. She did not know what was coming next. That was the thing she had finally made her peace with, not knowing, not having the outline, not having the plan, just the light through the window. These 3. This particular morning, in September, the garden green below, the roses blooming without apology, 3 small voices making their claims on the world. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything she had ever needed. She had just needed to find her way to it, and she had.
Before you go, I want to sit with you for just a moment longer, because this story was never really about a text message. It was never about a billionaire, or a pregnancy, or even a betrayal. Those were just the conditions. The real story, the one underneath all of it, was about a woman who had been slowly disappearing inside her own life, and did not know it, until everything fell apart. And in the falling apart, she found herself. Here is what I want you to take with you. Making yourself smaller does not make you safer. It just makes you invisible. And the tragedy is not that someone else erases you. The tragedy is when you erase yourself quietly, one compromise at a time, telling yourself it is love, or loyalty, or just the shape of things. It is not the shape of things. It is fear. Fear that if you take up your full space, if you ask for what you are worth, If you name what you already know, if you stop performing the version of yourself that someone else needs you to be, you will lose everything. But here is what Vivian discovered. Here is what the story kept trying to say all the way through. What you lose when you finally stop shrinking is not everything. It is only the things that were only staying because you stayed small. And those things were never really yours to keep. The person you are when you stop pretending, that person is not new. She has been there the whole time, in the old sketchbook at the back of the closet, in the soap she ordered because she loved the smell, in the list she made at 2 a.m. because she needed to believe she could take the next step. She was always there, waiting, quietly, for you to stop apologizing for her. If you are in a season where everything feels like it is falling apart, I want you to hear this directly. Falling apart is sometimes the most honest thing a life can do. It shows you what was real and what was only holding together because you were holding it. And when you see clearly what was real, you get to build from that, from something true, from the ground up, with your own hands, with full knowledge of what you are worth. That is not starting over. That is starting correctly, for the first time. Vivian named her daughters Eleanor and Clara. She named her son James. She went back to the work she loved. She planted the roses again in the spring. She stood at the nursery window one September morning with a baby on her shoulder and 3 voices filling the room, and she thought, I built this, not alone, but herself, with the full understanding of what she deserved. That is the ending. That is the only ending worth having. If this story stayed with you, if one moment in it felt like something you have lived, or something you are living right now, you are not alone in that. Leave a comment. Tell us the part that landed. Tell us what you are carrying, or just tell us you were here. Stories only travel as far as the people who carry them, and if someone you love needs to hear this today, send it to them, not with an explanation. Just send it. They will understand why. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. It means more than you know. This content was researched, developed, and manually crafted to bring meaning and real-life lessons to every person who listens. Every word in this story was chosen with care, not to entertain alone, but to remind you of something true about yourself that you may have forgotten. We hope it found you at the right moment.